This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 77. What's causing the productivity slump?
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, productivity. It's going nowhere, and nobody seems to be able to figure out why. The UK government has launched an industrial strategy to try and tackle the problem. So will the right sort of a government investment help? Or is the problem something more fundamental than that? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Well, in the 1960s, productivity growth each year in the UK was close to 3%. In the 70s, 80s and 90s, it was 2%. In this century, it's dropped to less than 1%. And in the first two quarters of this year, it's actually fallen. It's actually negative. Could that be because some of the most productive people are now moving home to Europe? Well, maybe, but no, because it's been happening for a while, as we've seen, and it's a similar story throughout the world. In Australia, for example, labour productivity was more than 2% right up to the last few years. From 2013, it fell below 1%. Now there, many people blame it on the economy's structural change. But what's the UK's excuse? In fact, across all OECD countries, productivity growth from 2015 to 2016 averaged less than 0.5%, 0.2% for the United States. You see the problem? So what's happening here, Steve?
Well, I think it's actually a definition of productivity is the ratio of output to the number of people employed.
Yeah.
We've got labour productivity. And that is statistically, it makes, it's an obvious comparison. What are the number of units of output per unit of labour input? But in the modern economy, this comes back to my arguments about energy again, labour is not the productive factor.
Yeah.
It's energy harnessed by machinery. And consequently, you can have a dramatic increase in the number of people employed and a fall in the energy throughput in machinery at the same time.
Hang on. Wouldn't it go the other way? I mean, if you had more machines doing more stuff and you had fewer people employed, you'd expect productivity to increase. Because as you say, it's output per hour worked. If machines are doing a lot of the work and there's fewer people, you'd expect the productivity to be increasing, wouldn't you? Yeah,
which is the thing is what's happening, the machines are not being installed.
Right.
So it actually comes down to the fact that the way we define it is output divided by the number of workers. You could have rising amount of output being produced by hiring more machines, and therefore the number of workers having a job going down, the output going up, and therefore a dramatic recorded increase in labour productivity. What we've seen is a fall in labour productivity. What that translates as is more and more people are being hired. So we're seeing a very, very low level of unemployment in the UK in particular, and a low level in America too. But the level of actual investment in physical productivity and capital has declined.
Right.
So we have more people doing really creative things, like, for example, selling second-hand houses to each other, or even better, selling second-hand shares to each other. And consequently, that doesn't turn up in GDP, but it does employ people. So the measure of recorded labour productivity is falling. The conventional interpretation is people aren't working as hard, they're not being as productive, et cetera, get a life. What's actually going on is because aggregate demand has been so low, except for assets, which of course the demand's coming larger, being spooked by central banks. There's a decline in the level of investment in actual physical productivity.
Right. So we're selling stuff that's not stuff that we've made. So we're being less productive from that point of view. So that makes perfect sense, and that would explain why over many decades, because we've seen asset prices increasing over the last 30 years or so. But what about this whole thing about since the global financial crisis? So if we look at the US, for example, the manufacturing sector grew at its productivity grew at 3.2% from 1987, but over the last 5 years, it's increased just 0.5%, and we can point to figures like that all over the world. Since the global financial crisis, is that just because of the uncertainty? We're just not investing in the plant and machinery anymore.
Partially. I mean, it's also because there is a demographic thing in terms of total output, in terms of output per head. Then it does come down to whether you're actually investing or not. And one of the weird things that comes out of my little mathematical model, the Minsky model I've done, which is the foundation of my overall economic analysis, is that if you have a runaway level of private debt, because capitalists are more willing to invest than another situation where private debt doesn't explode, what you actually get is a lower rate of growth. So with absolutely no change in the labor in the rate of growth of labor productivity, which is in my models, at the moment I haven't built a feedback between the rate of profit and the rate of change of labor productivity, which would therefore mean the rate of increase in the productive capability of machinery. Even with a fixed level there, so you don't have a decline in technological capability, what you get is a lower rate of actual investment. And this is one of the reasons you have to understand complex systems rather than just using straight old linear thinking, which is the way neoclassical economists think. You would think that a higher desire to invest by capitalists would mean a higher rate of innovation and a higher rate of growth. In our system, what it actually means is they're more willing to borrow money to invest. They therefore do borrow the money to invest. That increases the claims that the financial sector has on the income of the total income of the society. It actually ends up meaning that because that claim fluctuates over time, you get a declining level of investment. So because a higher desire to invest means a lower level of investment.
Because you owe that money still to the finance sector. Right. So
and it's if I want to take it as far back, you can see in Ricardo, one of the reasons Ricardo developed the theory of comparative advantage was that he wanted to eliminate the profits of the landlords and transfer as much money as possible into the hands of capitalists so that we would have more innovation and investment going on there. Because Ricardo did not understand banking, he little Shell and Petrie convinced everybody about the nature of where growth came from, which was another fallacy. But what he was correct to say, you don't want money getting into the hands of rentiers who fundamentally will just use it on profligate living. So in that sense, the rentiers of his day were the landlords. The rentiers of our days are the bankers. The rentiers of his day spent their money on carriages and, I imagine, snuff. And the rentiers of today spend it on Lamborghinis, and I don't need to imagine. I know it's cocaine. So we end up we end up snorting what should be going into increasing physical productive capacity.
Right. Okay. So if I've got this right, I mean, so the primary reason that it sounds, in part, it's because yes, we've had a bit of uncertainty since the global financial crisis, so companies might be a little bit more reticent to invest in plant and machinery. But even when they're borrowing the money from the banks. They may be increasing their output as a result of that plant and machinery, but then they owe a whole chunk of money back to the banks, so the banks are claiming a chunk of that value that's being created. So we're not seeing productivity increase because it's just going back to the banks. That's in effect what you're saying.
Effectively saying that, there's too much of the money, as Ricardo himself feared, too much of the money is going to the rentier, the profligate class, and not enough is going to the capitalist, the investing class, and innovating class. And as complicated as the argument is, that particular insight is correct.
So I wonder whether that also, that subdues the amount of money that you have available to pay people who you do need to work to work these machines. And we've seen prices subdued. And I'm wondering if there's a bit of feedback on that as well. Are people less productive because they're not getting so much money these days?
Well, they're less productive because they're not being hired to produce anything. And this is the other element of it. I hate how everything I say comes back to debt because I sound like I'm a one-horse pony. I have at least 2 horses. But the fundamental truth is there out of this very simple model of mine, which I now regard actually as being the equivalent to Lorenz's model in meteorology. What I see is the rising level of debt means the falling workers' share of GDP. The crisis, when it comes along, involves a collapse in profit share. That only happens at the very end of the whole cycle, however. But over the period of time that the crisis is developing, the rising level of debt causes a declining amount being paid to workers, and it also causes a lower level of investment. So by letting the private debt system get out of control, which is what's happened in the last 40 years, we've had a lower level of growth. That's the real cause of the decline in labour productivity.
But we've got close to full employment. That's what, we keep on getting told. Maybe there's a lot of part-time jobs amongst that, but, we've got more people employed, but we've still got productivity going down. But, as you're saying, because the benefits of that productivity is going back to the finance sector. But wouldn't you expect, as central banks keep on saying, if we've got full employment, we expect that prices, the wage prices are going to go up. then you could understand that productivity might be a bit subdued. But the fact that prices have stayed low, even though we've got full employment, and still productivity is subdued, is a curious one. Apart from the argument that you've just leveled about where that money's going.
Well, the other part of it, I mean, in the Americas, you simply can't trust the unemployment data. The unemployment data and the employment data have dramatically diverged. So when you actually factor in the number of people actually have a job, it's 3 million in terms of demographic change as well. It's 3 million less of the 25 to 54 age group in America than it was in 2007, and something like 5 million less than it was in 2000. So there's been, in America's case, they're far from what they used to call full employment. The unemployment numbers have been doctored over the last 30 or 40 years to be a way of punishing people for not having a job. So they're simply untrustworthy. In the UK case, still the same sort of dynamic about, unemployment is you only get recorded as unemployed if you've applied for a job that doesn't exist in the last 2 weeks. However, the employment data also seems to match the unemployment data in the UK. And what you have, though, is people are employed on 0-hour contracts and things of that nature. Yeah. So what you have is now being called the precariat. So you've been from the days when you had a highly organised labour force here with trade unions that were bargaining. Their backs were almost quite literally broken during the coal miners' strikes back in the 80s under Maggie. And now, yes, there is full employment, but it's wages which have fallen something of, in real terms, about 10% since the financial crisis. So people who are earning a wage are much, much closer to subsistence than they were beforehand. So their demand, in that sense, is lower than it would be if they were being paid the wages that were being paid even 10 years ago. And with lower demand, again, you have lower level of investment.
Yeah, and a demotivated workforce. I'm sure that is part of it as well. You don't, if you feel as though you're not getting paid what you're worth, you're not going to work as hard.
That's a large part. I mean, this is what the Russians, and the Russian system is worse on that front. Not the Russian, the old Soviet system, because the Soviet workers used to say they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. And I recently saw that very, very obviously when I was in Cuba about maybe 6 months ago, I think. And I think I may have told you I had a meeting cancelled one day, so I had a free afternoon. I thought I'll go for a swim. And I walked over to the tourist desk at the hotel. And as I approached, I could almost feel this go away wave coming from the tourist staff. And I got to the closest woman and said, I want to go for a snorkel at the beach. She said, if you go outside and ask one of the taxi drivers, he'll take you down there. And she turned back to what she was playing with on the computer. And I later on went there and I waited for 15 minutes. And he'll make eye contact with me in this room in 15 minutes. 3 women managed to completely avoid making eye contact with me. No, I'm not the most beautiful thing on the planet, but I'm not that ugly. So that's not quite. Okay. We'll talk about who's got a better face radio later. But the same thing is probably happening with the demotivated workforce. Yeah. You're getting 0-hour contracts. You don't get paid anything. You might turn up at work having commuted there at high expense on the tube system to the job and get there. Oh no, we don't need you. Go back home again. It's only terror is going to make you work in those situations, and people aren't quite terrified yet.
But I'm also wondering whether, another part of it is that we've got now dominant companies that are just so big that they are not as effective. And we've all been there. Well, maybe you haven't, but I've been there working for big companies where you spend your lives in meetings that achieve very little. And you think, well, okay, surely the smaller companies that don't have this meeting culture and this whole bureaucracy that big companies adopt, surely they can compete. But I guess if the one company is so dominant, are they prepared to make the investment? The risk of investing to compete. So those big companies can have a lot of fat in them, and they do. They just spend their time talking to each other.
Yeah, and it's also, this is the other thing about what do they decide to do in those meetings. They decide to buy their own shares back, rather than actually using that money to build any plant, because you think, well, there's not a lot of demand out there. And if there's not a lot of demand, even though there's full employment, the wages we're paying workers are so low that their demand levels are rising anemically, if at all. why bother investing? We want to give a return to our shareholders, and oh dear, by sheer accident, not at all deliberately, give ourselves a bonus as well. Let's buy our own shares back and therefore drive up the prices on the stock market.
So is there a policy solution to that? I mean, first of all, for that size, the size of companies getting so big, it's very difficult for people to compete, so they become less efficient. But also, as you say, yes, the idea that, they become so big that they've got so much money in their sitting in their bank accounts that they think, well, we won't invest in that in growth. It's much easier to buy back the company. Is there anything you can do policy-wise to try and stop that? Because in both cases, not very good for productivity or for the economy.
Well, let's actually have another talk about industrial policy, because that's another area I think economic theory is off with the fairies.
Right.
And there is this, like if you look back to 40 years ago, if I asked you what's the most dominant, biggest monopolistic computer company, what would be the answer?
So give me the question again.
I asked you 40 years ago, what's the biggest, most dominant monopolistic computer company?
IBM?
Yeah, okay. What's the answer today?
Microsoft? Google?
Or Apple?
Or Apple? Yeah.
Did they exist 40 years ago?
No.
Okay, so in that sense, the actual sort of monopolistic behaviour has persisted. The actual monopolist has changed quite dramatically, and there's been dramatic. So I want to talk about that as another issue. I don't think you can do it just by saying we're going to break up big firms and make them into small ones, which is often the way competition policy is practiced. But certainly, what you have, if you have absolutely sluggish aggregate demand, which we do have, and yet you have full employment at the same time, where workers are being paid so little, and workers are the ones who spend far more of their money than the wealthy do, then you can get trapped into why bother investing anything apart from the luxury market. And in the luxury market, of course, you produce extremely sophisticated gear with a very small clientele, and you make a profit in your firm. In terms of with the central banks on one side buying up all the shares as well, you might as well join the party too. And what you have is a dramatic increase in asset prices, but no particular increase in, back we go again, labour productivity.
Yeah. And I guess so long as people are cheap, you're not going to invest in machines.
Well, you'll always be investing in machines. But this is one of the actual barriers. The reason that the Watt steam engine, one of the reasons it was first invented in the UK rather than in France, for example, is that wages in the UK, particularly in Scotland, were much higher than they were in France. And it was actually the Watt steam engine would have been uneconomic in France. It was highly economic in the UK because it displaced sufficient labour to save you a large amount of money. So you actually, in some ways, low wages are part of the explanation why we have low labour productivity, because with low wages, no encouragement to replace them with machinery, less investment.
So pushing up minimum wage would be a smart move then, by that logic.
Yeah. Again, this is the whole the direct thinking does not work in something as complex as a capitalist system. So there's actually a whole developing theory called obliquity, saying that if you actually want to understand a complex system or change something in a complex system, sometimes doing the opposite of what is the direct route is actually the best way to get there. So if you thought, you think, unemployment's high and investment's low, let's cut wages, therefore giving more money to capitalists who will invest more, will grow faster. We've done that. It hasn't happened. In fact, if you put the wages up, you could force the capitalists to invest and then actually have demand to sell into, because there'd be workers with high wages before you sack them when you brought in the new technology. But that then gives you that creative destruction, which capitalism's major claim to fame was that capability of generating creative destruction and innovation and growth over time.
So the interesting thing is productivity is not just sliding in developing economies or developed economies, I should say. It's also on the slide in emerging economies as well. So we're also seeing productivity decline in India, in South Africa, in Russia, in China, supposedly big growth areas, but productivity is declining there. I guess that's the same reason, is it? Because they're getting financed, and the productivity is a chunk of that money is going back to the finance sector. No.
Like for example, in South Africa, the private debt level is only about 40% of GDP. Russia's also quite low. So I think what's more likely happening there is that there is a period where if you do start going from a very unequal sort of feudal style society to a more capitalist one of the first stages there is an expansion of the middle class. And while it's still cheap to hire people to do clerical work and stuff like that, when you don't have the the high wage cost to encouragement to try to replace them with software, it's quite possible you're going to have an expansion in the number of workers who are not directly working with machines. And therefore, if you divide your GDP by the employment rate and see how it changes over time, you're likely to get that change factor being low, simply because you're hiring more workers relative to machines than you would be when you reach our state, where we're trying to automate virtually everything, and therefore you can replace humans with software algorithms, which don't turn up, of course, as part of investment.
And you've got to balance that growth as well, I guess. I mean, so in China, we know overcapacity has been an issue. I mean, too much spent on factories that simply aren't needed. So I imagine, that could be part of the issue as well. That's going to bring the figure down. Oh, yeah.
Like one thing, when I was in China some time ago, about 3 years ago, I stayed there for about a month or so. I was fascinated to see the extent of industrial development all over this small, only 750,000 people town called Dayang on the outskirts of the capital of Sichuan. But I also, and I actually met an Australian guy there who was building a new sports car, designing a new sports car. So there's plenty of innovation going on, and the standard of living was quite reasonable. It was a very comfortable lifestyle, even as a middle-class person there, from what I could tell. But what you had as well was these huge recorded levels in employment and factory output. And I was wondering, where are they getting the money for the factories? It turned out that, first of all, a lot of the factories were established by and owned by the state government. Now, the state government, we're talking a state which, even in city governments, we're talking city councils employing, that have 20 million people in the city council and themselves might employ 500,000 people. They would sell land on the periphery of the council to developers. The developers are borrowing money from state-owned, partly all state-owned banks. So they'd buy the land off the council and then build, massive high-rises which are unoccupied. It's supposed to be a new town being built somewhere else. That money would go back to the local council, and the local council would establish businesses. Now, and then produce various forms of output decided by the local council, which weren't not necessarily sold, but the output was counted as part of GDP. So you get that's a substantial reason why you get some pretty weird figures on productivity coming out of China. So some of these things have rather more idiosyncratic explanations than just my one horse at the level of private debt. Yeah, but I mean, that raises the question about the importance of government investment. So we talked about how, perhaps because of caution since the global financial crisis, some companies just aren't investing. But does business need public money to invest in development for the business investment to follow? Because, is that part of the problem that we've been seeing for the last 10 years? I mean, we've been through an austerity drive in the UK. Government's not investing in a great deal. Yeah, and because the conventional economic theory has this concept of crowding out. So they say that if the government sector spends more money, that'll drive up interest rates and that'll crowd out private investment. In fact, when you do the work empirically, and an old friend of mine, Com Kearney, who was professor of economics at University of Western Sydney when I was there and is now back somewhere in Ireland, I believe, Com made his name by doing empirical analysis on this front. And what he found wasn't crowding out, it was crowding in. Yeah. So if the government was spending money and by investing in various areas, like, for example, unlike a little country I've just spent a bit of time talking to called Australia, investing in a sensible piece of technology like fibre to the house internet system, that would generate investment by the private sector to provide matching technologies into it. So if the governments themselves are deciding not to invest, it's likely the private sector won't do it as well. Yeah, well, and it's interesting, that crowding out argument, isn't it? Because nobody would ever say that the government building a massive port at Abbott Point so that they could export more coal from the private sector was seen as crowding out. They'd see it as being complementary. Yeah, and that's a lot of the role is complementary. We tend to have this model that we live in an economy which is resource constrained, and therefore the government takes some of the resources that are not available for the private sector. One of the people I've just written a tribute article for, and I've got to actually publish the article properly on my Patreon site soon, is Janos Kornai. And he's one of the few, I think, really, truly innovative and perceptive economists in the last 60 years. And Janos pointed out that capitalism is actually demand constrained. We have massive excess capacity, and it's partly there for competitive reasons. So you can actually expand output If the government it bumps up its demand, there's physical capacity for the private sector to expand output as well, and also to expand its capacity to produce output by investment. So we don't live in a shortage economy, and the myth that we do is partly why we're growing so slowly.
Yeah, I wonder whether also, I mean, we just reach a point. I mean, I was going to ask the question as to whether, there's such a thing as a ceiling on productivity, where we're still seeing productivity grow, but perhaps not as fast because we've reached a point where you can't grow as fast. And related to that, is demand also going to flatten out? Because just talking personally, and this might be, part of being middle-aged, but I don't have this desire to buy as much, actually in part because some of the stuff I've bought, like my phone, does things that perhaps 20 devices would have been needed, and a lot of what we're doing is sort of labor saving stuff. I'm actually running out of things that I want to buy, apart from the odd pair of trousers and
but they are pretty odd too, I agree.
Yeah. I mean, there's just so much there's only so many things that you can buy. So I just wonder, what I'm saying, are we reaching a point where actually our desire for consumerism is flattening out? We haven't got this same growth curve. And similarly, in terms of productivity, what machines can do, are we seeing that slow down as well?
I don't think so, because that's actually been a consistent myth in capitalism that have reached that particular point. I mean, you would know the guy in the American Patent Office who claimed back in 1900 that everything that's ever going to be patented has been patented. We might as well shut the office down. That was before the invention of nuclear power, air flight and TV and a whole lot of other things. So,
yeah, but apart from nuclear power, air flight and TV, what else has been invented? Exactly. Well, apart from the aqueduct.
There is an extent to which we're reaching a planetary limit, and this is, I think, the crucial thing. But if we actually get to the stage, and this is, I'm going to sound like a Elon Musk fanboy, which of course I am. If we get to the stage of off-planet production, then the capacity to produce things for us to enjoy is going to extend quite dramatically. However, when I look at it from my point of view and analysing production in terms of harnessing energy to produce useful work, you can reach the stage where you've raised the effective wealth of people so much in terms of their effective energy consumption that they don't want a great deal more. However, we certainly haven't done that for 6 billion people in the third world. So in that sense, it comes back to the income inequality once more. If we actually could provide income for people in the third world, I think we'd see a pretty dramatic boost of demand. But of course, that's not happening.
All right. Just final question on productivity. Let's look at Google. 72,000 people work for Google. It's got revenue of $90 billion US. That sounds pretty productive to me.
Yeah. And well, you get an enormous amount per person. Because that, again, there's prices and dynamics inside there, and the fact that software doesn't have a physical hardware cost. It's so you again get some investments, and particularly in computer algorithms, where you have an increase in output after you have a huge capital input initially, but there's no capital cost after that initial element. So that's the zero marginal cost end of the world, which is another thing we might discuss at length some other time.
But the fact that company established itself, more than 10 years ago, I mean, admittedly, it's seen a lot of growth over that 10 years. But I'm just wondering whether there's a bit of a cycle that develops here. So you have a wave of companies like Google and Apple, which are big on revenue, small on employment. And after they've reached a particular point, until the next one comes along and does the same thing, you are going to see productivity decline, aren't you? Because of the peak that was generated by companies like that.
That's partly Schumpeter's argument about creative destruction. I think it's quite correct. You do get these things going in waves. So somebody's initial success, like, for example, of course, Yahoo was the company that first gave us the search algorithm. But it was all, people manually deciding, manually searching, and manually putting indexes together. And Google comes along and does it algorithmically. And, of course, that takes over the entire market. If you want to look at technology that is similar to that today, you've got the huge growth in AI and the objective of getting AI-based transportation. So car drivers and everything else and taxi drivers and truck drivers go out the window. That wave has only at the very early stages. So if we do get the sort of Schumpeterian investment drive to perfect all that, then there could be a boom coming out of that, and that'll give us an increase in apparent productivity.
Right. And if you want to know, children, who Yahoo is or who Yahoo was, Google it. There's the irony. So, I mean, just in conclusion then, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying, though, is which is where we started. The major reason why we're in this productivity slump is because what investment is occurring is being creamed back to the finance sector, and we need to find a way of addressing that. So the finance sector, I guess, is investing in, the finance sector. Meanwhile, of course, is investing in asset speculation rather than productive uses, and that's not helping either.
That's really the zeroth order cause. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Very good. Great to talk, and an insightful half hour as always. We'll see you again soon.
When I stop coughing, okay.
He has been struggling a bit with that, hasn't he, over recent weeks. Now, look, next time, Steve often talks about the need for debt jubilee, writing off all the debt that is creating so many problems across the world. How would that work in practice? We'll look at that next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Hope you can join us for that one.